The snow fell in thick, silent waves, blanketing the forest in an eerie stillness. Ethan Carter sat by the crackling fireplace, his laptop open, but untouched. The cursor blinked mockingly on the empty page, a reminder of his failure to write a single word in weeks. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Claire's absence was everywhere, in the unfinished quilt draped over the couch, in the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the air, in the hollow ache in his chest. She had loved this place, loved the way the snow made the world feel quiet and pure. But to Ethan, the silence was suffocating. A sudden noise outside broke his thoughts, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something heavy collapsing in the snow. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The forest had been silent for days, the animals hibernating or driven away by the storm. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the cold biting through his thin sweater. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a massive black bear lying motionless in the snow. Its fur was crusted with ice, its eyes frozen shut. Two small cubs huddled against its body, their faint whimpers barely audible over the wind. Ethan's breath caught. The cubs were alive, but barely. Their tiny bodies trembled, their eyes pleading for help. He glanced back at the cabin, torn, bringing wild animals inside was dangerous, but leaving them to die felt like abandoning a piece of Claire's spirit. The wind howled, urging him to decide. Ethan stood on the porch, the freezing wind biting at his face as he stared at the cubs. Their tiny bodies shivered against their frozen mother, their faint cries cutting through the storm. He clenched his fists, the cold seeping into his bones, and glanced back at the cabin. The warm glow of the fireplace beckoned him, but the cubs' desperate whimpers tugged at his heart. Claire's voice echoed in his mind, soft and insistent. "They're just babies, Ethan. They need help." She had always been the compassionate one, the one who brought home injured birds and stray cats. He could almost see her kneeling in the snow, scooping the cubs into her arms without a second thought. But Claire wasn't here. Ethan hesitated, his breath visible in the icy air, bringing wild animals into the cabin was reckless. Bears, even cubs, were unpredictable. They could attack, destroy the cabin, or worse. And yet, leaving them to freeze felt like a betrayal, not just of the cubs, but of Claire's memory. The larger cub let out a weak cry, its eyes locking onto Ethan's. There was something unervingly human in its gaze, a plea that went beyond instinct. The smaller cub nuzzled its mother's frozen body, its movements growing slower as the cold sapped its strength. Ethan cursed under his breath and made his decision. He rushed inside, grabbing a thick blanket and a pair of gloves. The wind howled as he knelt beside the cubs, his hands trembling as he wrapped them in the blanket. They were lighter than he expected, their bodies fragile and cold. The larger cub growled weakly, baring tiny teeth, but it was too exhausted to resist. The smaller one curled into the blanket, its breathing shallow. Ethan carried them inside, his heart pounding as he laid them by the fire. The cabin felt different now, the air charged with uncertainty. Ethan stared at the cubs, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. He had made his choice, but something told him this was only the beginning. The cubs huddled by the fur there, shivering, slowly subsiding. Ethan watched them, his unease growing. They seemed harmless, even pitiful, but something felt off. Their eyes faintly glowing in the dim light held an unnatural intensity. The larger cub let out a low growl, its gaze fixed on Ethan. He stepped back, his heart racing. The growl wasn't like any bear's, it was distorted, almost human. The smaller cub began to twitch, its fur bristling as if charged with static. Ethan's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cabin creaked, the wind outside. Now a guttural roar. He grabbed a poker from the fireplace, his grip tightening as the cub's growls grew louder. A faint hum filled the air, emanating from the cubs. Ethan's breath caught as their bodies began to shift, their forms elongating unnaturally. The larger cub's eyes glowed brighter, its teeth sharpening into jagged points. The power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Ethan stumbled back, the poker slipping from his hand. The cub's growls turned into something else, a chilling, otherworldly sound that made his blood run cold. The flashlight's beam trembled in Ethan's hand as he backed toward the fireplace. The cub's distorted growls echoed in the dark, their glowing eyes slicing through the shadows. The larger cub lunged, its elongated claws raking Ethan's arm. He cried out, pain searing through him as blood soaked his sleeve. The smaller cub skittered across the floor, its spine arching unnaturally, jaws snapping with a wet, clicking sound. Ethan swung the fireplace poker blindly, striking the creature's side. It screeched, a high-pitched, almost metallic sound, before retreating. The larger cub circled, saliva dripping from jagged teeth. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he edged toward the bathroom door. With a desperate lunge, he shoved both cubs inside and slammed the door, his weight holding it shut. The wood shuddered as the creatures threw themselves against it, their growls morphing into guttural snarls. Ethan's mind raced. Claire would have known what to do. But Claire was gone, and he was alone. The door splintered, a clawed paw bursting through. He stumbled back, clutching his bleeding arm. The cubs weren't cubs anymore. They were something worse. He wasn't saving cubs. He had brought something far worse inside. Ethan barricaded the bathroom door with a chair, his hands shaking. The cubs' snarls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. A wet, tearing sound seeped through the wood, followed by the crunch of bone. "What the hell are you?" Ethan whispered, pressing his ear to the door. The answer came in a gurgling growl. The door exploded inward, splinters flying. Ethan stumbled back, flashlight beam catching the creatures. They were no longer cubs. Their bodies had elongated into grotesque parodies of bears, spindly limbs, twisted spines, and slick black skin where fur had fallen away. Their jaws hung open, rows of needle-like teeth glistening. The larger one's eyes burned electric blue, fixed on Ethan. He froze, Claire's voice echoing in his mind. "Run!" The creatures lunged. Ethan bolted, their claws tearing the couch to shreds. Behind him, he dove into the basement, slamming the door as the monsters screeched. Their claws scraped the wood, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. The journal! The journal! He remembered the previous owner's warnings scribbled in the margins. They are not of this world. Upstairs, the creatures began to laugh. Ethan waited until the screeching faded, before creeping back upstairs. The creatures had vanished, leaving claw marks gouged into the walls. He grabbed the journal and a hunting knife, then ventured into the storm, driven by a desperate need to understand. The frozen bear lay where he'd found it, but now its body was split open, the ice around it stained black. Ethan gagged at the stench, rotten flesh and chemicals. The bear's ribs were hollow, its organs replaced by a nest of writhing, translucent worms. The journal's pages fluttered in the wind, revealing a sketch of a towering humanoid creature labeled the Frostborn. Notes described it as an ancient entity that implants its young in living hosts. The bear hadn't frozen to death, it had been infested. A low rumble shook the ground. Ethan turned as the bear's carcass twitched, its hollow eyes glowing blue. The Frostborn emerged from the tree-lean, its icy claws dragging through the snow. Its face shifted, morphing into Claire's. "Join us," it whispered in her voice. Ethan ran, the Frostborn's laughter echoing through the storm. The creatures cornered Ethan in the kitchen, their jagged teeth snapping. Max, his loyal husky, lunged from the shadows, snarling as he clamped his jaws on the larger creature's throat. The beast screeched black, ichor spraying the walls as it thrashed. "Max, no!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. The smaller creature sank its claws into Max's side, tearing through fur and flesh. The dog whimpered but held on, buying Ethan seconds. Blood pooled on the floor as Max's growls faded into silence. Ethan's grief erupted into rage. He grabbed a propane tank from the stove, hurling it at the creatures. A gunshot from his rifle ignited the gas flames, engulfing the kitchen. The creatures howled, retreating as fire consumed them. Ethan stumbled into the basement, clutching Max's collar. The dog's sacrifice had saved him, but the Frostborn's laughter still echoed in his mind. "You cannot outrun grief," it whispered. Ethan loaded his rifle, tears freezing on his cheeks. "But I can fight it." In the dim light of the basement, Ethan flipped through the journal, his hands trembling. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles and sketches of the Frostborn, a towering, humanoid creature made of ice and shadow. The previous owner had written, "It thrives on grief. It takes the form of your deepest sorrows, feeding on your pain. The cubs are its offspring, born from the bodies of its hosts." Ethan's breath hitched as he read further. The Frostborn was ancient, a predator that had haunted the forest for centuries. It lured its victims with illusions, using their grief to weaken them. The only way to defeat it is to let go. It cannot survive without your pain. Claire's face flashed in his mind, her smile, her laugh, the way she'd looked at him. The Frostborn had used her memory against him, twisting it into a weapon. A faint whisper echoed through the basement. "You'll never let me go, Ethan." He slammed the journal shut, tears streaming down his face. "I have to."